that would curb our spending, and it would, somehow magically create perfect equilibrium in the economy, and that would create a kind of preservation of the resource for the future. This is insane. This is an insane idea. So we don't have the critical tools to think economically how we can get beyond the price system to be able to do that. And yet we have the tools to be able to do that within our own movement. And those tools have to do with commons and the enclosures and the rolling back of the enclosures. Because to roll back an enclosure is not only to go through the legal system, it's about refuting the system of the economy in which that enclosure takes place. Because it was only enclosed in the first place to create a profit, to create a long-term investment, and that investment amortized over a 30-year period, for example, is much greater for a corporation than it is to extract fossil fuels, for example, than to really produce green energy. The rates of return for investing in fossil fuels today are much greater than they are in investing in the green energy industries. Why is that? Because of the interest rates and because of the entrenched system that we have that promotes a debt-based economy. So what are the keys that we have at the local level or at the level of a commons to be able to change from a debt-based system to something else? Elinor Ostrom, many other scholars, a whole movement across the world have identified commons across the world that are self-regulated. They exist parallel with governments because the commons are existing within places where there are already state systems, already local municipal systems in place across the world. And every country obviously has a different legal system. So the laws that exist here are not parallel to laws that exist at local levels in Africa or other places, obviously. And so to do a comparative analysis of that is very difficult. But some of the principles emerge, which is that commons have been self-regulated in history, and they are being self-regulated now. A group of people gets together, manages their own resource outside of the legal tradition that's going on, or in parallel with it. So in other words, this is historically the very same principle that took place with our ancestors who managed their own resources before they became privatized. And then the next step was taken. The state was created in order to provide a legal monopoly on violence to enhance the privatization of that local resource. So the two things grew up in parallel, the privatization as well as the state monopoly over enforcement powers, usually through violence and the covert threat of it or overt threat of it. So with those two measures, the commons movement has looked at successfully managed commons locally that can work and that have worked. And that gives us hope that there is a kind of thing as self-determination that can exist in a completely different way than we've determined that it can work under the definitions of international development that we've had since World War II, for example, under the Bretton Woods system or under the theories of development that we've inherited that are all around that kind of conditioned our understanding of how to make these things happen. And the commons movement gives us a whole new perspective because it shows us now that there doesn't need to be a division of labor in society, and there do not need to be interest rates, and there does not need to be inflation and all the kinds of things that develop out of the kind of currency system that we have presently. Because the commons within itself, scaled up from local to the global commons, gives us the tools we need to create a new economic system that can then support what we need to do at the local levels. So what would a new global economic system look like? Or what would a new global political system look like? Well, we've learned a lot of lessons from what we've been seeing in Europe lately, that if the United States, or should I say when the United States dollar collapses, and a new international monetary system has to be created. And this is inevitable. No monetary system in history has ever lasted for long. They always collapse. There are too many pressures involved at that level to make it a viable system last forever. So when it collapses, is the world going to revert to a kind of monopoly currency like the United States has had for the last 60 years? Or is it going to do something a little bit different in terms of a multipolar currency? Or could it think outside the box and actually begin to dwell on the idea that instead of basing a currency value on gold or silver or oil, perhaps we could actually understand it as the creation of value globally from the natural resources that we identify as common. Not only water and food and natural gas and oil that are in the ground, but the atmosphere and the rivers and the lakes and the forests, as well as cultural resources and genetic resources and intellectual property, social resources. How do we do that? Well, we already have currency baskets. We already have major sets of indicators to talk about the value of commons across the world. We could create a sustainability rate to replace an interest rate. Interest rate is a debt-based kind of system, and sustainability rate would guarantee that we wouldn't have inflation or deflation. It would guarantee that a whole new kind of credit system could be created. How do we get there, and why would we get there, and isn't this too far-fetched? Isn't this something for the 22nd century? Not really, because it's right around the corner, because we've got major choices to make within the next 10 or 15 years about the creation of a new international economic system. And it's not too early to begin to say, at the local levels, you are actually a part of this by the work that you do in the work that Ben's talking about and the work that you do in community organizing, even though you're not thinking at all about international stuff. But the fact is that the commons have to scale up at some point. They have to scale up from the local level to the global level. And mostly at the local level now, the commons is a territorial concept. It's seen as something that needs to be taken through the legal process to really reverse the pecking order, as Ben was suggesting, in terms of the decision-making process. Because all too often, something is privatized, or the state can be regulating, or a local municipality can be regulating a particular resource. People need to take that power back into their own hands. And at the same time, we've got to be able to say at the global level, the same kind of thing needs to take place. Because here's what's happened at the international level. And here's my particular interest, because I do work both in the international level and the local level, and I try to begin to introduce to people that the scale is different, and yet at the same time the whole thing has to become scale-free. And it's going to happen in the next 30 years, that we will see a scale-free system across the world. Because a new multilateralism will be created, a new international balance of power will be created along with the recognition that the local commons will scale up globally. And the exciting dimension of this, I think, for our purposes, is to recognize that this new world that's possible is not going to be possible unless we begin to recognize that it's not a matter of the local versus the global anymore. That the local expertise is vitally needed at the international level, and yet at the same time, the international policies that, as they emerge over the next 30 years, are going to be really vital in supporting people at local levels to be able to do what they need to do in managing their own commons. Because the main difference in the scale between the local and global commons is that while the local commons is seen as territorial, the global commons is seen as something more functional. And historically, they came from somewhat the same root. Local commons were traditional commons. They were customary commons. They were informal norms that communities created before there were laws that over a period of time, people said we need to enshrine these in a formal document, and the document became no longer customary law, but it evolved into civil law. And it's civil law that we're challenging now. We've forgotten the customary law. We're trying to bring customary law back into, through natural rights, through a new perspective on what the meaning of law was in the first place, how we got to this perspective of civil law. Let's not forget the perspective of customary law as it existed. So it's given us this idea about public domain. And public domain